The Hollowing Part 1, The Return to Blackvale. The town of Blackvale had always been a place that seemed to exist on the edge of time. It wasn't that it was particularly isolated. No, it was only a few hours' drive from the nearest city, but it felt out of step, like it had been forgotten by the world, suspended in a perpetual twilight that leached color from the earth, giving everything a washed-out, bruised look. The mountains loomed around it like silent guardians, their peaks hidden by an ever-present fog that whispered of secrets long buried. Clara Mercer hadn't wanted to return to Blackvale. In fact, she'd spent a decade trying to forget it. But the letter had come. Thin, brittle paper with her sister's name scrawled on it in jagged, desperate handwriting. Lila was missing. Again. Clara hadn't spoken to Lila in years, not since the fight. Lila, always the defiant one, had disappeared into the shadows of their family's crumbling house, and Clara had thought it best to let her be. But now, after all this time, the echo of Lila's absence grew too loud to ignore. She needed to know what happened, to put her sister's ghost to rest. As Clara drove into Blackvale, she saw the signs, faded, rusted metal markers indicating townspeople who had gone missing over the years. The most recent names were from months ago, yet no one seemed to care. The town was in a stasis, moving in quiet, ghostly rhythms. The few people who remained here wore hollow eyes, faces drawn from years of secrets and unspoken things. Clara made her way to the diner, a small, bleak place with peeling paint and cracked windows. The waitress behind the counter gave her a long, steady stare before she slid a cup of coffee in front of Clara.
"Ain't no use digging up the past,"
the waitress muttered.
"The dark's got its own appetite."
Clara stiffened.
What do you mean by the dark?
The waitress shook her head.
"Don't ask too many questions, miss.
You won't like the answers."
She turned away, leaving Clara alone with the unsettling taste of dread in the air. Later, Clara sat with the local sheriff, Hale, who seemed both reluctant and disinterested as he flipped through his notebook, glancing at old reports.
"Kids see things,"
He muttered.
"Figures near the coal mine, shadows, fleeting things.
His eyes shifted nervously as he adjusted his hat.
Imagination, most likely."
But Clara saw his knuckles tighten around the thermos in his hands. He was hiding something. The coal mine loomed ahead as Clara drove toward it the following day. Its entrance gaped like a wound in the earth, black and yawning, as though it was waiting for something to come inside. The mine had been closed for years, abandoned since a collapse had claimed several workers' lives decades ago. Now only rusted machinery and crumbling buildings remained, remnants of a past that the town had long since turned its back on. Clara parked her car at the entrance and stepped out. The air here felt wrong. It was thick, laden with moisture, and carried a faint metallic smell, like blood. Her flashlight flickered as she ventured into the mine, casting weak beams of light against the jagged rock walls. Deeper into the tunnel she went, the temperature dropping with every step, the silence growing oppressive. Then, on the ground, she spotted something that made her stomach churn. A child's hairpin, delicate and tarnished with age. Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was Lila's. Suddenly the air around her seemed to thicken, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. Her flashlight sputtered, casting eerie, wavering shadows along the walls. The silence was broken only by a low, almost imperceptible whisper.
"She's ours now. She's ours."
Clara spun around, but the whisper came from everywhere and nowhere at once. She stumbled backward, her hand slipping on the cold, damp rock. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt something, a presence behind her. But when she turned, there was nothing. Her pulse was racing as she made her way out of the mine, the hairpin still clutched in her hand. She felt the weight of it like an omen. That night, Clara stayed in a rundown motel. The room was empty except for the shadows, which stretched unnaturally long, as if the darkness had a mind of its own. She tossed and turned, unable to escape the images of the mine, Lila's hairpin, and that whispering voice that seemed to follow her everywhere. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move. Clara woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. Her reflection in the mirror seemed wrong, smudged, as though someone had breathed on the glass. The outline of her own face was distorted, features melting into the darkness. And then, she saw it. In the mirror behind her, a figure, a shadow, too large to be her own. Clara turned, but there was nothing. She stared at the mirror again, but this time her reflection was still. She was alone, but the darkness remained. The following day, Clara visited Mr. Pritchard, the elderly librarian. His brittle fingers slid a leather-bound journal across the desk toward her.
Found this in the archives. This town has a history. Your sister ain't the first to disappear like this, and she won't be the last.
Clara flipped through the pages of the journal. The handwriting was shaky but legible. The entries described disappearances dating back to 1892. Each one seemed to follow the same pattern: victims last seen near the mine. As she read, a cold shiver crawled down her spine. The last entry was the most chilling. It read, "The hollowing has begun. They walk among us, but they are not us." Clara's hands trembled as she closed the journal, the weight of its words sinking in. This was no coincidence. The disappearances weren't random. They were part of something much darker, something that had been happening for over a century. That night, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she walked back to her motel, the trees seemed to whisper, their branches creaking in the wind. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, like they were reaching out to grab her. Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked the message, a single line from an unknown number. "Don't go to the mine." It was too late. The next morning, Clara met with Elias Voss, a local historian who had lived in Blackvale for decades. His cabin was tucked away in the woods, nearly swallowed by the ever-encroaching trees. The air around it was thick with the scent of camphor and decay. When Clara asked about the mine, Elias seemed to shrink. His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper.
"The mine's no mine. It's a hive. The founders made a pact long ago. Every 30 years they give a soul to the shadows to keep them sated. Your sister, she interrupted the cycle."
Clara's mind reeled. A hive? A pact? She couldn't comprehend it, but the more she listened, the more it made sense. Lila had never been an easy child. She was rebellious, reckless. She had always stirred the pot, always pushing against the boundaries Clara had set for her. But this was far beyond anything she could have imagined. That night, as Clara ventured into the woods, she felt it. The shadows closing in around her, moving as if they had a mind of their own. Suddenly, she was surrounded. Figures emerged from the trees, shifting shapes. Some were human, some grotesque, all with eyes that gleamed in the darkness, their faces contorting into grotesque mimics of the missing townsfolk. And then, she heard it. Lila's voice, sweet and familiar, but twisted and cold, slithering from the darkness.
Join me.
The shadows reached for Clara. Their hands were like black ink, dripping with hunger, trying to pull her into the void. As she fled, her hands brushed the side of her car, leaving inky smudges on the door. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were collectors.